meeting you right where you are on your foster care journey. This is the Forgotten Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Forgotten Podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Cabe, and I am so happy to be with you. If you are part of the foster care community, passionate about serving, or simply interested in learning more, we are here for you. In every episode of this podcast, you will hear stories from men and women who have experienced foster care to one degree or another. They may have grown up in the system, are caseworkers, foster parents, or others who are here to bring you hope or encouragement. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe and share it with a friend. And remember, you are not alone. I hope you enjoy the Forgotten Podcast. So DJ, I'm so happy to have you on the show today. Before we really dive in, I would love to help our listeners get to know you a little bit, give us a little context of who you are. And I'll start by just sharing some of the basics, but then I want you to fill in the gaps, okay? So you're a husband, a father, an author, a mentor, coach, counselor, and sports statistician. Mm-hmm. that word is hard to say.
I know.
But we're going to talk about the time that you spent in foster care and some of the things about your journey, but anything to like highlight or just give us a little more context about who you are and let's just start there.
Yeah. So just a person who had a traumatic childhood, and it's kind of started with my mother and my father having me when they were 16. And I don't remember too much what was happening when I was born. But I always mention that because that tends to set up all of the stuff that I ended up dealing with, in my childhood. And so shortly after I was born, I would say at least 1 or maybe even 2 years into it, my dad was out of my life dealing with his own trauma and different things. And it's so funny, you mentioned that I'm an author, and my book, The Sun Is Always Shining, is like a fictional story based off of my life. And so when I was writing my book before, I did not care what was going on with my parents. Like I was just kind of feeling some type of way about them because of the way that my childhood was. But when I was writing my book, I challenged myself to kind of get their side of the story. I challenged myself to understand what was happening for them that kind of led to where we are now, or, where with our connection, which I'll share later, but like just in general of like what those different things that happened in my life, like fixing it and figuring out how to get to a point where I'm healed and I can ultimately help others. And so I discovered that my mom was dealing with her different traumas and has some experiences that caused her to have a baby at 16. And I believe she had a baby at 14, but was forced to get an abortion. So then my father was dealing with traumatic situations. I tell stories about before foster care, my stepdad was an abusive person. And my dad shared with me that he was abused, being whipped with jumper cables at one point in his childhood.
Oh my goodness.
And so it's like, coming from a place of a healed perspective, being able to ask them directly, which for many, many years, I didn't care what they had to say about it, but just understanding like, oh man, like this is trauma. Like this is, these experiences that cause families to go by the wayside and pick up the pieces afterwards. So, I think who I am today, the person that you listed as far as all the accomplishments and all the things that I've been able to do in my life, it started off rocky. It started off with what I wanted to set the precedence of my parents who were experiencing trauma when they had me and how that ultimately ended up.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that trauma cycle continued, right? But what I'm seeing just from the very little bit that we've talked already is you're breaking that cycle, and you've broken that cycle.
Yes, have
That's
broken
awesome.
it and working slowly but surely to continue to break it.
Yeah.
I was the first person in my immediate family to graduate from high school, graduate from college, get a master's degree, own a business. And
wow, that's so
just
wonderful.
Continually, pushing the envelope on what's possible. And a lot of that motivation is just me wanting to be the best version of myself. I know a lot for a good portion of my life, it was to inspire my siblings. I have 4 other siblings that I live with my mom before we all 5 went into the foster care system. And so for my 4 siblings, I always kind of, especially going into the system, I took it upon myself to be the one that they can look up to and be the one that they can say, "Ooh, my brother did it, I can do it." And so, I put a lot of pressure on myself in my adolescent years to really try to be successful, try to move the needle on certain things so my siblings could see that it was possible for them.
Wow. So we're going to dive deeper into your story, but I just want to ask you, you have on here, you're a mentor, a coach, and a counselor. Talk to me about, what do you see the differences and how you live those roles out differently? Because they all have similarities as well. And what I love about all 3 of those things is you're helping people.
Yeah.
But talk about how those kind of look different.
Yeah, so mentor and counseling kind of goes hand in hand in my perspective. Well, at one point I was strictly a mentor, and then I, became a counselor and started doing that work. And then I've been a coach for a while, coaching youth teams and coaching track and field. And so now, which is so funny, like I now coach parents and I help parents and I motivate them to be better with their teens. And when it comes to counseling / mentoring, that is essentially what I use to work with my students. So I'm blessed. Literally just recently, I quit my job at Fox. I would say I quit. I resigned. I stepped down from my job at Fox as a researcher for one of the sports shows on Fox Sports 1. Because I was a person who kind of lived the double life. You mentioned I was a sports statistician. Well, I was literally over the last 4 years working full time at Fox while also running my business on the side, which is like a consultation, educational consultant type of business where I work with one school district at the moment where we provide individual and group counseling to students. We provide parenting workshops. And so I was juggling both of those things until recently where I decided, you know what? I want to do this full time. I want to work with families. I want to work with students. I want to impact lives, right? And so being able to kind of navigate, both of those responsibilities and now solely focusing on this, the coaching, mentoring aspect is when I work with students, it's like sometimes they need a counselor and sometimes they just need a mentor. Yeah. And I was talking to one of my students yesterday who I've been working with since she was a freshman. She's a senior now. And when I was working with her as a freshman, she needed a counselor. Big time. And now that she's a junior, well, even last year, I started to see like that transition from a counselor to a mentor. And now as a senior, she's doing really well, got college in sight. And so now it's like, okay, you actually need a mentor now. And so now when we meet, it's like, hey, it's a check-in. It's a mentor status. It's like, hey, I'm here for you if you need anything. And so that's kind of how I've utilized each of those responsibilities. Is like I'm coaching parents, trying to help them out, trying to, move them in the right direction. Because I think when you think of parenting classes, I think people always get this idea like, well, I'm going to go somewhere and they're going to tell me how to parent. And me, when I run groups or I run workshops, I'm like, no, first of all, you are just as much an expert in this parenting game as I am. And so I want just as much as I'm going to provide insight and expertise to you, you're going to do the same for me and the other parents that are part of this group. And so I operate as a coach when I work with parents. It's like, look, I'm trying to put all the pieces together so we all can make it to the end zone. So that's how I used each of those responsibilities.
I love it.
Yeah.
Do you find yourself using sports analogies often?
I thought it was fitting, just knowing that I am in sports and still will be involved in sports. But no, it's funny. I I don't know how often I might do it and don't even realize I do it. It's something I'm gonna start paying attention to, especially when I work with students. And my specialty is working with male students. Being able to use sports a lot of times to bridge the gap between us and them. And one of the things I pride myself in the work that we do in the schools is like a good portion of the students that we see probably won't ever seek counsel or therapy outside of this interaction that I'm going to have with them. And so we're meeting with a lot of students who are getting that type of interaction for the first time, which I pride myself on. I'm excited about because it's like, oh, I'm exposing them to something that's different, maybe to something somebody who actually relates to them and hears them and sees them for who they are. And so they're going to have a positive experience around wanting to seek mental health resources and counseling and things like that, as opposed to like, I had one therapist who just totally didn't relate, totally didn't connect with me. And now my entire experience of mental health is like done because I don't want to ever do it again.
Right. Yeah.
So I think I find ways to communicate and connect with students that help them understand like, whoa, we're just talking. We're like, yeah, that's pretty much what therapy is.
Totally. Well, I asked because my team is going to be like, don't try, Jamie, don't try, because anytime there's sports people who are, you the sports statistician, I'm like, ooh, what kind of analogies can I make? But I'm not a sports person. So mine don't work.
But you understand them, right? Like you understand
I do understand them. Yes. I might goof them up if I tried to make one. So I'm going to let you stick with the analogies. Okay, well, let's really get into some of the meat here. But thank you for sharing that. And I can absolutely see your passion for coaching, for caring for people, for helping them be who they fully need to be, right? Or are who they fully are. But DJ, you entered foster care at age 4. And you said, is that correct?
I was 4. 4th grade.
4th grade.
Yeah,
okay, well, we're going to repeat that then. I'm glad that you said that.
No worries.
Okay. So, DJ, you entered foster care when you were in 4th grade, which was probably, 8 or 9 years old?
Yeah, 9 or 10. Yeah.
9 or 10.
I might have been 9, probably 10. Yeah.
Okay. What do you remember about that time? What do you remember about that day? Do you remember that day?
Yeah, it's very vivid. So, you could kind of see the signs. Even though I was that young, I was the oldest of my siblings, and I was always treated, like you're the oldest, be responsible for your siblings, watch over them. Like I had a lot of responsibilities on my plate, even in the 2nd grade or 4th grade. Sorry. And so, well, shoot, it was 2nd grade. I'm thinking back with my pet even before 4th grade, but in that moment, in that time, I definitely was kind of the leader, kind of the man of the household. And so let me backtrack. So it started with a house fire. So we were living in an apartment. It was me and my 4 other siblings and my mom and my stepdad. This particular day, my stepdad was at work and my mom went somewhere. I don't know. She had something. She went grocery shopping. I'm not sure, but we had a babysitter at the house. And so we were downstairs kind of making lunch. And one of my favorite pastime lunches, even through college, was hot dogs and noodles. For whatever reason, those two things went together for me. And so we were downstairs making lunch. And when you think of hot dogs and noodles, you have to boil it in water. So if it's burning, it'd be kind of weird because it's in water. So we started smelling smoke. And we were like checking the food. We're trying to make sure, like, what's going on here? And so meanwhile, my brother, who's could be pretty mischievous when we were younger, was upstairs kind of by himself. And what was wild, it was so much going on that day because we actually had some maintenance people working in our bathroom upstairs. And so we ended up, trying to figure it out. And then next thing you know, the maintenance people started running downstairs. Hey, everybody out. There's a fire. It turns out my brother was like playing with some incense or something like that and was like lighting them and left it in a closet. And all of a sudden it sparked the fire. And we had an apartment fire. So what was crazy is because of, the trauma that we experienced and how we used to get into trouble, in terms of like, if we got into trouble, there was a consequence of a bell or whooping or whatever it might be. Instead of like, man, our family is safe, we didn't hurt ourselves, like everything is good. All I could think of as a traumatic child, my brother is going to get it. That's all I could think about with this house fire that's impacting our life. And all I could think about is like, man, we're going to be in so much trouble. And so we ended up having to stay at, the Red Cross put us in a hotel for a couple of days. We were eating at restaurants. As kids, we're like, oh, this is the best. But, not really recognizing that was going to be the beginning of us being homeless.
Wow.
And so we ultimately landed in a hotel in the next town over. And we stayed there for, I remember, at least a couple months before my stepfather, on his way to work, I think got arrested for speeding or something like that. I don't know exactly what happened, but he ended up going to jail. And so my mom was kind of left to fend for herself. And at that point in time, the only work that she was doing extra work around the motel. So she convinced the motel to kind of hire her to help clean and do stuff while she was at home with us. And so eventually we ended up staying with some family friends. And then eventually after that, my mom was able to find a 2-bedroom house that we ended up staying in. And so while we were in that home, that's when you started to see the signs. So my mom, what she was doing for money at that time was exotic dancing. And so, every other night or so she would go and do that. And there would be times she would bring people home. And then there's, either, I'm trying to remember the time frame, but I think a month later, I remember finding like I didn't know what it was at the time. I know now, like little crack pipes and different things around the house. And so one day my mother came up to me and she just kind of explained to me like, I can no longer take care of you. I'm going to, get myself together and you guys are going to go stay with, at the time it was my grandmother. And once I get myself together, I'll get you guys back. Like that's the conversation that we had. And I think so many things that have been happening in our lives throughout that point. I don't remember having a real reaction. I don't remember crying. I just remember saying, okay, Mom, like I just remember saying, all right, well, here's another thing I got to check off the list of, all right, let's just power through this. Let's just figure this out. Yeah. And ultimately that's ultimately how we ended up going into the foster care system, under kinship, but, in the system.
So, so she did she share with all of you at the same time, or was that just to you as the oldest? And then were you kind of passing it down the line? Yeah,
I just remember it being me. And, I can't remember exactly if she had a conversation with them or I imagine she told them something, but I think she gave me the details since I was the oldest. But I think my siblings just thought like, oh, we get to go stay at grandma's. Like I don't know if they thought too much of it. Yeah.
At what point did you start to feel like, okay, this isn't, or did you? Was there a point when you started to feel like, okay, this isn't normal? Like, it's not normal to have, you didn't know what the drugs were at the time or those things, people coming in, that wasn't necessarily a healthy childhood. At what point did you recognize that maybe your life had been different than some of the lives of kids at school or things like that?
I honestly don't think I'm looking back. I don't think it was middle school. I really barely don't even think it was high school. I think by high school, I recognized that I had went through some things, but I don't think it's still truly registered like how impactful my traumatic childhood was, or like how I wasn't supposed to be the person that I am based off of these things that I had experienced. I honestly don't think it was till college where it really set in for me. Like, whoa, like you have an A score of 10 by the time you were in high school. Like, whoa, that's crazy. So like, it really didn't set in for me until college, where I was learning about trauma, learning about counseling, different things, learning about what is a normal childhood. And I just think as a kid, as a middle schooler, even through high school, like it's such a way of life for so many people. Like when they're in the trauma, that like it's normal to them. And I think that's why so many people push back when it's brought up to them. It's like, whoa, no, you're questioning my my being, you're questioning my existence. And I think for me, it was like that learning that I finally got, and it was just, and then I started backtracking and having real conversations around it once I understood and knew like, oh, this is something. This is something that happened. Because for a while, like, I wouldn't tell people my story. I just would go about my business, do what I need to do, be a good student, keep my head down, don't make waves. That's kind of the way that I operated. And so, man, it probably wasn't until I started going to open mics where I would share stories through poetry, and then working with students initially, where I would tell them like, hey man, this is what I went through. And they'd be like, what? And then I realized how liberating and powerful it was for me to share that with them. That's when I really started to like embrace my story and really share it with others.
Wow, that's awesome. You mentioned something in passing that some of our listeners know, others would not, but you said I had an ACE score of 10. Talk about what that means. What is ACE?
So the ACE is the Adverse Childhood Experience. It's a survey that they did with about, I forget the exact number, but I want to say 30,000 people they surveyed to see what traumatic experiences did they have in their childhood by the time they turn 18. So some of the things that they might ask you. And so it's 10 events that happen in your life. And if you could say yes or no to them, you get a point for each of the things that they ask you. 10 is the absolute highest that you can get on it. And some of the things that they ask you, just so you get a context, is physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, had a parent be incarcerated, had a parent suffer through mental illness, had a parent get divorced, or had parents that got divorced. I can't think of the others, but those are kind of the ideas of what it is. And so to experience 10 of them by the time you get to high school, just to give you context, the survey says there are so many health risk factors that happen when you experience trauma. If you have the trauma and you don't do anything to deal with the trauma, these are the things that you're at risk for. And one of the things is your lifespan. If you have a 6 or higher on the ACE score, your lifespan could potentially be shortened by 20 years. Wow. 20 years. So the numbers, the science, the research says that I'm not supposed to be the person that I am today. But there's the other aspect of it, and that's resilience score. And that's, positive adults and different things that tend to come into your life that maybe combats that trauma that you experience in your childhood. Wow, that's very cool. There was a time, and you'll have to kind of fill me in on when, at what age, but where you really started fighting to get control. So you were recognizing that if life felt out of control. What led up to this? Like, can you talk to this? Yeah. So one of the things I always talk to parents about, I specifically work with parents of teens, and that is the idea of autonomy and control over their lives. The tendency for parents of teens, when they see that naturally thing occurring for the kid, which is they want more control over their life, they want more autonomy. The natural thing for parents to do is tighten up and say, nope, I'm in control. I'm the adult, yada, yada, right? That's the natural thing to do.
Yeah.
And so what I encourage them, and I tell them like, no, this is good that they want this. And so you have to find a way as a parent to naturally or help them cultivate that for themselves. So now that I know that information, I'm looking back in my teenage years, and that's what I was searching for. That's what I was looking for. And that was autonomy over my lives and the decisions that were being made behind my back that I didn't have a say in or a voice in. And so it started about 8th grade. So the summer of 7th grade year, my grandmother was just kind of getting tired. And at that point, so when we initially went in the foster care system, all 5 of us went to stay with my grandmother. Then somehow, some way, my stepdad got out of jail and was able to get us back. And so we went to stay with him about sixth grade, summer of sixth grade year into sixth grade. He ended up going to jail again. And so from there, my 5 siblings who I had been living with essentially all my life, we then got split up. So my 3 siblings, my brother, and 2 of my sisters went to stay with their auntie. And her reasoning for not taking all of us was, I'm not her brother's kid, which is my stepdad. And she was just too young, my youngest sister, Audi. So me and my sister went to go stay with grandma again. And then the other 3 siblings went to stay with their auntie. And then we never lived together again. My brother actually did stay with us at one point when I actually lived in a foster home that actually turned out to be relatives of my biological dad, so that's why I ended up staying in kinship. But for the most part, we, never stayed together again. And so So then while we were living with my grandma, for about another year or so, my grandma realized that she just couldn't take care of us anymore, couldn't give us what we needed as we were getting older. My sister was, had trauma, and her parents weren't in her lives, so she was struggling at times in school. And I wasn't doing too bad, but I was getting older, getting into stuff and having some challenges. So, grandma was just like, hey, they finally, my case manager asked me, or social worker was like, hey, what do you want? And I was like, well, I want a mom and a dad. Like any other kid, right? I want to have to, have you visit me here and at school and all these other places. I kind of want a normal life. Like, I want to not have to hide the fact that I'm in the foster care system. And so they set up a meeting with the foster family. I likened it to like being recruited for college. So you go and you spend the weekend and you kind of hang out and you see what it's like to, your potential place that you're going to live, or the potential place that you're going to go to school someday. And so we did that, and it was fun and it was cool. And I was like, okay, I like this. Let's do it. And so 8th grade, me and my sister went to go stay with this family. And then after that, we realized like, oh, you're actually relatives of my biological dad. So it turned out to be a kinship situation. But while I was there, the goal, the initial push for me to do that was to be adopted. And so we were there, and, my case manager would ask me like, what do you want? And I was like, well, I thought we established that I wanted to be adopted. And so I remember my foster mom / auntie would say, we won't adopt him because he's too old, but we will adopt his sister. It's the younger daughter. And so I was like, well, you know what time it is? It's time for me to leave, because I came here with the premise that I would be adopted. I don't necessarily like living here. It's, it works. It's cool. But there were some injustices that I didn't like about it. And so I was like, I'm ready to move to somewhere who actually is going to adopt me. So then I ended up moving with another auntie. And she was trying to start the process of adopting me, and I think she had some issues financially where she wasn't able to make it happen. And so junior into my senior year, we lived in Indianapolis. I'm from Indiana. We lived in Indianapolis, and I'm from Fort Wayne, and so we lived in Indianapolis, and it was just, I remember that being the best year of my life. Like, the school was great, the friends that I made was awesome, and I was just like, man, I want to spend my senior year here. Well, that summer, my auntie decided that she wanted to move back to Fort Wayne. And so this is where I was like, no. Like, I finally was putting my foot down. I finally was like, no, I love to hear. I'm tired of people making decisions for me. I'm tired. I'm not even a bad student. I never failed a class. I'm doing well. Like, I don't understand why I can't, have what I want. And all these people keep making all these decisions for me. And so we were going back and forth that entire summer. At one point, I think she called the police on me because I had went to stay at my friend's for like a whole week, and I didn't check in. And I didn't say anything to her. And then ultimately, we ended up coming to the solution that I would move to California with some family members out here. And I remember going to court, and it was literally, we went to court the day before I was scheduled to fly out the next morning out of Indianapolis. My mentor thank goodness for him. He bought my plane ticket. He bought me luggage. He kind of gave me some cash and kind of set me up to really, take that trip. And so we go to court, and I'm in the court, and I hear the judge and I hear them, and it sounds like a very routine court day, like where we're getting updates on our parents, and it's just kind of like a routine thing. It had nothing to do with what I was planning on doing, and that was leaving the state. And so I remember hearing all this happening, and I just raised my hand, and then he called on me, and I was like, I'm not sure why nobody has mentioned this, but I'm scheduled to fly to California tomorrow to finish high school and then ultimately go to college. And then you see my auntie's jaw drop. And you see the case manager and the judge is like, is this true? Like, can we vouch for this? And they were like, and then my auntie finally spoke up, and she was like, yeah, he set everything up, and we got a, family over there that he could stay with. And so the judge is like, well, since you are almost 18 and
wow,
you've been a good student and you haven't made any waves, you've done what you were supposed to do, I don't see why you can't do this. And so that day I said bye to my siblings, who thankfully were there, and I moved to California and finally had an opportunity to make a decision for my life.
Wow.
And it was a battle leading up into that point, but it was worth it.
Wow. So did you actually get emancipated at that point? Like, did he from foster care?
So I didn't officially get emancipated until I turned 18. So when I went out there, I think my case manager, social worker, was still kind of staying in contact with me, barely. I know they were trying to help my auntie, who I ended up staying out with in California, with resources and different things. But it was August and I turned 18 in November. So it's like,
okay,
they're just like, yeah, I mean, cause I was about to sign up for school. Like, I had everything set up. I did the research. If I stayed in California for at least a year, I would get residency at college. So I was just like, this is the move. This is what I want.
Wow. And had you not spoken up, what would have happened?
I think I would have just left and been AWOL or something.
Oh my goodness.
No,
wow.
I don't know. I don't know. But something in me felt like I needed to say something. Like, I needed to let these people know, like, this is my plan and this is what I want to do.
That's so cool. Mm-hmm. How is this? Like, what is the impact of feeling so voiceless? Well, how does that impact a person? How did that impact you?
I mean, just a person in general. Like, I think of my students a lot. Like, I have one student in particular who I feel I am maybe the only person that he can truly have a voice with, because everybody else either doesn't hear him, doesn't see him, doesn't understand the struggles and the trials and tribulations that he goes through in his life. And so it's just an overwhelming, like, you just feel so alone. You just feel like, am I ever going to be heard? Am I ever going to be taken seriously? And for me, like, in some aspects I was taken seriously because I was a good student and all those different things. But in some aspects, I'm like, this should merit me at least having some type of control or decision over my life and the things that I want to do with it. And so for me, like, for all those years of, like, why ain't nobody listening to me, or why is everybody speaking for me when I'm fully capable of speaking for myself? It was just one of those things where I finally was just like, no, like, this is what I want, and I don't understand why I can't have it. And for them to finally adhere to it and just hear me out, it was one of those things where I'm like, finally, thank you.
What do you think, like, as for us, as we listen to your story, what are ways that we can maybe even unintentionally shut down someone's voice? And then vice versa, how can we encourage, making sure we hear the voices of others, the voices of those with lived experiences and such?
Yeah, I think it's just, we don't practice active listening enough. I think the way that our society is set up, we are listening to combat. We're listening to have a rebuttal. We're not listening to literally hear people and what they're saying. The other thing that I mentioned to parents last night is like, we are a society who lacks empathy for people in general, but just overall, it just feels like when you look on social media and you look at parents with their kiddos, like we just lack the ability to feel other people's feelings. We lack the ability to put ourselves in people's shoes and say, man, I really feel for you right now. And I really feel the pain that you are experiencing. That's empathy. So I think being able to put yourself in a space where you're empathetic, it automatically, for me at least, puts me into a position to hear people out, to listen to their side of the story, to hear what they're struggling with, to hear what they're dealing with. So that's the first part of it. And then active listening, where you hear somebody, you recall what you heard from them, or you get clarification if you didn't understand what they said. And those are ways that we can really, truly hear people when they're trying to tell us something, or they're trying to communicate something to us. And a lot of times, you know, people will get upset and say, oh, but they're not ready to hear me out. They don't want to share. And it's like, okay, be okay with that as well. Like, be fine with the fact that you might not get something out of these students, out of these kiddos, just because they've been going through a lot, and they might need to, it might take them a while for them to actually trust you and trust that you have your heart in the right place. So that is something that we got to kind of be aware of as well.
Yeah, that's so good. Why do you think we as humans struggle so much to really listen to each other?
Because I think so many of us have not been listened to ourselves. And so when you have not been listened to, you don't have the ability or practice to listen to others, but you kind of get this attitude and kind of frustration where you're like, well, nobody listened to me. Why should I listen to you? I think it's a struggle for so many of us, because for me, I think of the dominant parenting style that has been kind of at the forefront, which is authoritarian, my way or the highway. And there's a lot of kids who ultimately became adults who had their voices stifled, who had their emotions not validated, who say, oh, you're crying, go shut up somewhere, or go somewhere and stop crying, right? Like, stop having humanly emotions. Those people ultimately become adults who have a hard time being empathetic to others, have a hard time being in tune with their feelings, but more importantly, being extra uncomfortable with other people's feelings and emotions. One big gripe that I have is like the way society deals with grief. It feels like society is saying to all of us who are grieving, get over it, move forward, life goes on. Yeah. And unintentionally, it doesn't come off that way. It sounds like, oh, it'll be okay. They're in a better place. Like, there's softer ways to help people push people past their grief. But I think so many of us are just so uncomfortable with emotions, but more importantly, we're uncomfortable with grief. And so because we're uncomfortable with it, we want to push people past their grief when it's not even theirs. So yeah, I think I can do a whole podcast on that. But
So what do you think? Because obviously you, again, 10 on the ACE score, not having a voice for so many years. Yeah. But yet you've pushed against that. Like, you haven't been defined by that. How have you found healing, and how have you pushed away? So now, instead of being uncomfortable with emotion, you're leaning in, and it's really cool.
It took a while.
Talk about how that process looked.
Yeah. So I think went into high school. Middle school, high school were the years where I was fighting and angry a lot, suppressing. That's why I feel those emotions were most intense. I literally was known in some of my neighborhoods as a person who was like, don't start nothing with DJ because he's going to want to fight. And that was that anger, and that was that frustration that I had. Because think about this, like, you know, I shared my traumatic childhood that I had. I share my traumatic childhood that I had, but also I also would get bullied in school, and there was all those different things that were happening. And so there was a lot of anger and frustration that I was harboring and holding on to literally through high school and into college, really. And a lot of that anger and frustration was put towards family. And I had some moments and situations that kind of led me to really look at myself. Cause I think because of my traumatic childhood, and I think a lot of people who have gone through trauma can relate to this, because of my traumatic childhood, I have every reason to blame the people who hurt and harmed me for the way my life ended up. Every reason. But I think the power that ultimately happens for us is that we finally decide what we can control and control that, and not focus or worry about the things that we don't have control. So I had a moment, and I finally had an impasse where there was some things happening in my life and I was kind of stuck and I was dealing with mild depression. And I finally just asked myself, DJ, how are you hurting yourself? So many of these other people in your lives have hurt you. Your mom left you. Your dad left you. Your stepdad was abusive. Like, all these people have hurt you. But I want to know, how have you hurt yourself? And I was like, whoa, you're right. Like, I run from my problems. I don't deal with them head on. I have a hard time with conflict. I have a hard time dealing with some of my big, deep emotions. That's something I can control. That's something I can deal with. Wow. So that was the beginning of me, writing poetry and opening up at open mics. And then ultimately, when my son was born and being married to my wife, like, kind of when you're married and when you have a kid, it's constantly having a mirror put up to you and saying, this is what you look like when you're angry and frustrated, and so when my son was born, I think maybe a year or two later after he was born, that's when I first went to therapy. I know. You're probably out there like, are you kidding me? All the stuff that this guy went through, and he didn't go through therapy until he was, what was that, 2019? That means I would have been 20-something, late 20s, mid to late 20s. And so, yeah, like, there was a lot of things that kind of led to it. And honestly, like, I can pinpoint people who I think really helped me in those times, even when I was struggling in middle school and high school. My mentor was one. He was somebody I met right when I went into the foster care system. I remember my grandma kind of establishing some things when we stayed with her that made me kind of start to shift and see things differently. And I just relied a lot on my community, the people that I interacted with. I played sports. So all these things were like kind of coping skills, coping mechanisms that helped me stay at bay and not go too crazy and not make too dumb of decisions. But ultimately, it was honestly getting married and having my wife point some things out to me, and then my son being born, and I'm like, oh, I really got to work through some things. So that's how I kind of landed to the person who can embrace the feelings and the emotions and ultimately help others do the same.
Wow. That's awesome. And are you thankful? Are you thankful you did, that you've put the work in?
Yeah. I'm still putting the work in. I talked to my therapist recently, and we got another appointment set up soon. So definitely still a work in progress, but I'm definitely happy that I have arrived to this place. Not necessarily because I am where I am in my life, I guess you would say is a success, but I'm finally in a position to help others. And I've helped so many students over the years, and now I have the opportunity to help so many parents. For me, that's the most powerful part. Like, now my story at one point, but at one point my story was such a hard thing to deal with, a hard thing to share. Now it's literally being used for gain. It's really literally being used to help and uplift and inspire and motivate others.
That's incredible. Wow. It takes a lot of vulnerability, and it takes a lot of work. I mean, I did not grow up with a traumatic childhood, and yet I have plenty of things that I have to work through in my life, right? Yeah. And so I think for all of us, we need to be constant learners and grow. But I just want to applaud what you have done in that work, because I know I can imagine the amount of work and the amount of pain in the work, and having to look back and having to reconcile some of those things is very messy and is not easy. And it's probably feels easier to just quit the work.
Very much so. Very much so. I want to pause because I think my MacBook is going to die, and I don't want it to mess up anything. So let me go get my charger real quick.
Sure.
So I was like, this was such a good interview, and I would hate for us to...
Oh man, that'd be a bummer.
crisis averted.
Cool. Do you want me, was there anything you wanted to add to that, or do you want me to ask another question?
You can ask another question. Yeah.
Okay. Let me think where I was going to go. Oh, yeah. Well, DJ, I know we're actually about to wrap up here, but I just want to give you an opportunity because, first of all, I just want to thank you for sharing your story, for being on. I think that there's a lot of takeaways in this our time together, but I just want to give you the opportunity. I can see the passion in you. Who do you want to talk to as we close out? Like, is there anything that you want to say that hasn't yet been shared?
I think for a while, and I still struggle with it to this day, like saying that I was in foster care, even though I still stay with family, even though I was still in kinship. The reality is one of my good friends always reminds me, like, you didn't live with your parents. You didn't live with your mom. You didn't live with your dad. Like, that's enough to send any kid down a path, right? Especially if it was like my situation where I lived with my grandma for a year or so. Then I lived with my stepdad and then moved from him after a couple months. And then after a year or so, went to stay with another family and then stayed with them for a couple years before I stayed with another family and then stayed with them. So it's like, over the course of my life, I went to 10 different kindergarten through 12th grade schools, 4 elementary, 3 middle schools, 3 high schools. And even in middle school, each year I went to a different middle school. So for those out there who are like, I'm in the foster care system, but I'm not quite in there, because I want to also validate those people, because it's like, like, this is why I have a struggle, because I'm like, I know y'all going through it. You're in strangers' homes and people that you have no connection or ties to, that you're going from home to home, situation to situation. But I just really wanted to speak to those who maybe feel how I felt, of like, I really wasn't in foster care. I was with family still, but the reality is I was, and I did have to go to court dates, and I did have a social worker, case manager that would check up on me at school. And I did have even though my life was essentially better when I went into the foster care system, that doesn't mean I didn't have my struggles. That doesn't mean I didn't have my challenges. And so I just kind of want to speak to somebody out there who just have experienced life in the way that I have, and just needed somebody to just kind of validate their experience in the system, because, no matter how you got in there, you got in there, and being able to kind of manage through that and grow through that and ultimately become the best version of yourself is ultimately what I want for you. And I hope this message was able to kind of deliver you from a place that maybe I was at one point, and just kind of let you know, I see you, I hear you, and I love you.
Wow. I want to just repeat that. I see you, I hear you, and I love you also. I think that it could be very easy for a well-meaning, I put that in quotes, so maybe a truly well-meaning person to say, oh, well, at least it wasn't that bad. Or at least it wasn't, right? And those things, that is not validating, right? Like that invalidates the pain you went through. And so we as people just want to be really, really careful that we are, because we just have no idea the stories of others. And we don't get to say how good or bad their experience was for them. That is their story, right?
Exactly.
So I don't know, DJ, I just thought of that as we were talking about. I just want us to be people who listen and who learn from one another, and who just, see, hear, and love each other. That's what we need. So I am so... Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, one of the things that I've learned in this work with parents is that you can't love your kid enough, and you can't love them too much. And I feel like in people in general, the people that you're entrusted with, the people that are in your immediate circle or maybe outside of the immediate circle, like, we can't love people enough. Like, we gotta have that spirit and that heart to kind of get back into a community mindset. I think so many of us are like, it's my family. I gotta get it. I gotta, work for my family and my family only. And it's like, no, like, I think we are community people first before we're anything. And maybe society, maybe the economy, maybe all these things has forced us to really think selfishly about our family and the things that are happening. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I think it's come at the cost of us not thinking in a community mindset. And so, being able to just say, look, I love you. I care for you. I appreciate you. I'm checking on you. Like, those are things that just go such a long way.
Yeah. Wow. Well, DJ, our world is absolutely a better place because of you. So thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Jamie.
Yeah. Thanks for being on the show today. Well, I hope that today's episode encouraged you wherever you are on your foster care journey. We want you to stay connected, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you will never miss an episode. Also, we have great content at theforgotteninitiative.org. Thank you for watching. I cannot wait to be with you next time.